The millman had the burn pile already lit when Earl Hollis drove up, and he had to shout over the tractor to make his offer, which was the strangest offer the mill had heard in years. "Don't burn it," Earl said. "Let me have it. All of it, however much you got." Wade Chalmers, who ran the county mill, looked at the old farmer like he'd asked for the ashes. 40 tons of grain sat under a tarp behind him, rejected, sprouted in a wet harvest, some of it heating, some of it going to mold, unfit for flour and unfit, any honest man would tell you, to feed to an animal, because spoiled grain carries a poison that kills livestock slow. The mill couldn't sell it and couldn't legally move it, and had been paying to haul it off. "Earl, you can't feed this to your cows," Wade said. "It'll founder them. Kill them." "I know it," Earl said. "I'm not going to feed it to cows." Wade waited for the rest. Earl didn't give it. He backed his flatbed up to the pile and started loading spoiled grain nobody in 3 counties would touch, and Wade Chalmers let him, shaking his head, and told the story that night at the diner. And by morning the whole county was laughing at Earl Hollis, who'd hauled home 40 tons of poison to feed to God knew what. But what none of them knew, not Wade, not the diner, not the neighbors already writing Earl off as a widower gone soft in the head, was what his wife had left him, folded in the back of a notebook, the winter before she died. Earl was 61 and 18 months a widower, and the farm had been going under by inches since Ruth passed. She had been the reader of the 2 of them, the one who sat up nights with the ag bulletins and the library books and a pencil. While Earl did the muscle of the place, she kept the ideas, and he kept the fences. And it had worked for 34 years until the cancer took her in a spring and left him alone with 200 acres, a banknote, and a silence in the house he could not stand to sit in. Ruth had kept notebooks. Dozens of them, going back decades, in a careful slanted hand, soil tests, breeding records, weather, and in the last one, the one she'd been keeping when she got sick. Page after page about a thing Earl had thought was nonsense when she'd tried to tell him about it from the hospital bed. She'd clipped an article. She'd underlined it twice. And in the margin, in a hand already gone shaky, she'd written the line that Earl had carried like a stone in his pocket ever since. "Nothing's waste, Earl. It's just food that hasn't found the right mouth yet." He'd nodded at her the way you nod at a sick woman, and put it out of his mind and buried her, and nearly lost the farm grieving. And then one hollow night that winter he'd taken down her last notebook, because he could not sleep, and could not bear the quiet, and he'd read what she'd been trying to give him at the end. She had spent her last months working out, on paper, a way to save the farm, and it started with the exact thing the mill was about to burn. Because Ruth's idea was not to feed the spoiled grain to animals, it was to feed it to insects. The article she'd clipped was about black soldier flies, a fly whose larvae eat almost anything, spoiled grain and mold and rot that would kill a cow, and thrive on it, and turn it in 2 weeks into fat white grubs that are nearly half protein, clean protein. The exact thing every chicken and every fish and every hungry animal needs and that costs a fortune to buy. The larvae didn't care that the grain was ruined. Ruin was their whole diet. They ate the poison and grew, and what they left behind, the spent castings, the frass, was fertilizer worth money on its own. Ruth had done the math 3 times in her shaky hand. A single acre of larvae bins, she'd written, fed on waste the county paid to burn, could out-earn the whole farm. Earl didn't understand 1/10 of it that first night, but he understood her handwriting, and he understood that his wife had spent her dying time trying to hand him a way to live, and he decided, sitting there at 2 a.m, that he was not going to let her last idea go in the mill's burn pile. So he hauled home the poison, and the county laughed. They laughed harder when they saw what he built. Earl converted an empty hog barn into rows of long, shallow bins, warm and dark and humid, and he seeded them from a starter colony he ordered in the mail. Ruth had written down where, and he began at 61, in the barn where the silence was thickest, to farm maggots. That was the word the county used. Marge down at the feed store, kind as she meant to be, told people Earl Hollis had lost Ruth and then lost the thread, out there raising flies in his grief. Cletus Dowd, his own neighbor, put it plainer at the diner. Man's feeding rot to worms in a hog barn, Cletus said. That's not farming. That's what farming looks like when a man's given up. Earl heard all of it. He let it sit. He walked the warm bins twice a day and learned, the way Ruth would have, what the larvae wanted, the right heat, the right damp, how deep to spread the spoiled grain so it wouldn't overheat and cook them, how to time the harvest for the day before they crawled off to pupate, when they were fattest. Ruth's notebook was his only teacher, and her margin note was the thing he said out loud to the empty barn. Nothing's waste. It's just food that hasn't found the right mouth yet. He found the right mouths a bin at a time. The doubter with teeth wasn't Cletus. It was Roy Trask at the county bank, who held Earl's note and had been patient about it out of respect for Ruth, and who drove out that first winter to see what the widower was doing with the loan money. He didn't go in the barn. The smell turned him at the door. "Earl, I knew Ruth, so I'll say this kind," Roy said. "You're behind 2 payments. And you're spending what's left converting a hog barn to raise. I don't even have a word for it. I've got to protect the bank. There's an outfit that'll buy your acreage clean. You could pay off the note and rest. Nobody'd think less of you." "Ruth would," Earl said. Roy didn't have an answer to that. "I can carry you till spring," he said finally. "That's the most I can do. Come spring I need to see something real, or we'll have the hard conversation." He got back in his car, careful not to breathe deep, and drove off certain the grief had won. The setback came at the end of that winter, and it came the way it always does, at the thing Earl had let himself start to love, because the warm barn full of living things had become, without his noticing, the first place since Ruth died that he didn't dread walking into. A cold snap came through and the barn's old heater failed in the night. Black soldier fly larvae are tropical. They can't take cold. Earl came out at dawn to a barn gone frigid, and every bin sluggish and dying, weeks of work and the breeding colony Ruth's notebook had told him how to start, chilled and failing in the grey light. He got the heat going too late. Most of them died. He stood in the ruined barn with the notebook in his coat and felt the whole thing go out of him, the farm, the idea, the last thing his wife had made. That night he sat alone in the cold barn on an upturned bucket, Ruth's last notebook open on his knee, and the margin line came back turned all the way against him. Nothing's waste. Everything was waste. He was a 61-year-old man alone in a hog barn full of dead flies, chasing a dying woman's fever dream because he couldn't bear to sell her farm. And the county was right. And the bank was right. And he'd let Ruth down one last time. He didn't sleep. He held the notebook against his chest the way he used to reach across the bed that wasn't full anymore. But somewhere in the cold he heard her. Not the fever line, but the real Ruth. The one who never once let a failed batch of anything be the end of it. Who'd say, "Well, Earl, what did it teach you?" And it had taught him. Plain, the larvae were tropical and the barn was old. And if warmth was the whole margin between living and dying, then he would stop trusting a 50-year-old heater and build the heat in. Insulate the bins, bank them close. Use the heat the larvae themselves threw off when they fed in a mass. The way Ruth's notebook, he saw now, had circled twice. They warm themselves if you keep them deep. He'd spread them too thin. He'd been afraid of cooking them and let them freeze instead. He rebuilt smarter, and he rebuilt from the few survivors, and by that spring the barn ran warm off its own life. Rows of bins turning the mill's poison into clean protein on a 2-week clock. Tons of spoiled grain a month becoming grubs and frass. The most alive 200 square feet in the county. The moment it clicked for everyone came the way it comes, with a customer, and a scale, and a number nobody could laugh at. Earl had found his first buyer the plain hard way. He'd driven 2 hours to a trout farm he'd read about, a young couple raising fish who paid dear for protein feed and hated what it cost, and he'd brought a cooler of his dried larvae and let them run it through their fish. And the fish did on Earl's grubs what fish do on their natural food, which is thrive. The trout farm placed a standing order. Then a pastured egg operation 2 counties over heard about it and wanted larvae for their hens, because hens raised on insect protein lay the deep-yolked eggs that fetch a premium, and they wanted his frass for their pasture besides. Refrigerated grain waste came in the front of Earl's barn for free, and dried protein and bagged fertilizer went out the back for money, on a county road that noticed every truck. The day it clicked, half the county found a reason to drive past. Because the sight of it undid the joke completely, Earl Hollis loading pallets of clean, dried, high-protein feed and bagged fertilizer onto buyers' trucks. Product worth more by the pound than anything the good ground grew, made entirely out of the poison the mill had been paying to burn. Cletus Dowd stopped at the fence and did not say the diner thing. Wade Chalmers, the millman, drove out himself to see what the widower had done with the grain he'd nearly torched, and stood a long while doing arithmetic he didn't like the size of. The numbers were not a fortune from the sky, and Earl would have laughed at anyone who said so, because he'd watched Ruth do the math in a shaky hand, and he'd checked it a dozen times since. But the grain came in free, the labor was his own, and the protein and frass sold into markets starved for exactly what he made, so that one converted barn on 1 acre cleared, its first full year. More than the 200 tillable acres it sat among, into the low 6 figures, every dollar of it traceable to a mill's burn pile and a dead woman's notebook. The most profitable acre in the county was a hog barn full of grubs, which brought Roy Trask back out, and this time he stood in the barn door and made himself breathe. He watched the bins work. "I offered to sell your ground out from under you," he said. "For your own good," I told myself. "You carried me till spring," Earl said. "That's why there's a spring. That's a thin thing to be proud of. It held anyway." Earl wiped his hands. "Here's what I'd rather, Roy. Every farm in this county's got waste it pays to get rid of, and a note it's behind on. I'll show any one of them how to do this that wants to learn. The bank could send them to me instead of to the auction. I'd rather this county turn its waste into money than sell one more widow's ground to an out-of-town outfit." He let it sit, no barb in it. "I'm not going to hold the offer against you. You meant it kind. But Ruth would want the farm saved, not bought. Let's save some." Roy didn't have an answer, but a handshake, which from a bankman was nearly an apology, and within 2 years there were 3 more barns like Earl's in the county, one of them at a young family who'd have gone under otherwise, all of them fed on waste the mill used to burn. The goods spread the way Ruth would have wanted it to. Wade Chalmers stopped paying to haul off rejected grain and started sending it to the farms that could use it, and Earl's operation gave winter work to 2 men in a county that had none. And the trout came up fat, and the eggs came out gold 2 counties wide. That was the summer the county stopped laughing. By the next spring they'd stopped calling it the maggot barn and started calling it Hollis feed, and the widower they'd pitied had a standing at the diner he'd earned a bin at a time. Earl kept Ruth's last notebook on the kitchen table where she used to sit and read it, and he added to it now in his own blunt hand under her slanted one, heat records, harvest weights. The things the larvae taught him, so the book kept growing the way it would have if she'd lived. Some evenings he'd walk the warm barn at last light, the bins alive and working, turning the county's waste into the county's wealth, and he'd say her margin line out loud to the animals nobody thought to raise. "Nothing's waste. It's just food that hasn't found the right mouth yet." She'd been right, the way she was right about most things he'd nodded through. The mill's poison wasn't waste. His grief wasn't the end. Even the man he'd become alone in that house wasn't finished. Just food. Maybe, that hadn't found the right work yet. Ruth had handed him a way to live from the far side of dying, and it had taken a barn full of the humblest creatures on the place to teach a stubborn old man that the last thing his wife gave him was the truest. Nothing worth anything is ever really waste. It's only waiting on someone patient enough to find the mouth that's hungry for it. If you've ever taken in the thing everyone else was ready to burn, and found the use in it they couldn't, tell us about it in the comments. We read them all. The moral is as plain as a note in a margin. What one person throws away is only a resource that hasn't met its purpose yet. And the same is true of people. The grieving, the counted out, the ones the county's decided about. Nothing is waste. It's food that hasn't found the right mouth. Tell us where you're listening from tonight, and about the person who taught you to see worth in what everyone else hauled to the burn pile. If this story found you, share it with someone sitting in a silence they can't stand. Sure, the best of their life is behind them. And whatever the world has written off around you, or in you, right now, may you have the eyes to see the use in it, the patience to raise it, and the quiet grace one evening of standing in the warm and knowing you turned what they'd have burned into the most alive thing for miles.